the visible, if it does attain this level of real aesthetic quality, it draws you through it toward the invisible source of all beauty, toward the pure form, if you want, who is God.
Welcome back to the Word on Fire show. I'm Brandon Vogt, the Senior Publishing Director at Word on Fire. There's been a shocking uptick in the number of people around the world destroying famous pieces of art, which has raised a lot of questions about the value and the purpose of art. So that's what we're going to discuss today with His Excellency Bishop Robert Barron, Bishop of the Diocese of Winona, Rochester. Bishop, good to be with you.
Hey, Brandon, always a joy to be with you too.
Wanted to update people on a couple things in your life. One is you just had this big press conference announcing something exciting in your diocese. I thought you could share it with all of our listeners here.
Yeah, we're moving our pastoral center from Winona to Rochester. So about 4 years ago, our diocese became the Diocese of Winona, Rochester, and a parish in that city was named the Co-Cathedral. So we kind of anticipated this move a few years ago. It's been thought about for a long time. So when I arrived here, I knew it was kind of in the works. But through the generosity of a particular donor, we have the land and the funds, and we really do need it. And for a variety of reasons, it's a good idea to move from Winona to Rochester. So I announced it, and we have a Minnesota winter intervening, but we'll probably start the serious building process in the spring, and then about a year from that point, it should be finished. So hoping about a year and a half from now, we'll have our new pastoral center, which is much needed in wonderful Rochester.
You shared some of the architectural renderings, and I think the feature that got the most attention was the chapel there had this beautiful rose window, which I know is central to your spirituality.
Yeah, and I really wanted the building to be not just a bland office building, but to have something of the Catholic spirit, because it'll be right there in the, not quite downtown Rochester, but near the heart of things. And I wanted it to be evangelical, that people going by would say, hey, what's that building? And it's got a Catholic ethos and spirit. So looking forward to that.
Well, second exciting development is that just a few days before this episode airs, it marks the launch of your newest book, and it's titled The Great Story of Israel, Election, Freedom, Holiness. This book offers a theological and spiritual commentary on the first half of the Old Testament. And I know, Bishop, this was your big COVID project of all the evil and suffering that came out of that terrible pandemic. This was one of the goods that came out of it. So tell us about this book and why people should pick it up.
There are two, really. One was the Creed book, Light from Light. I wrote that at the beginning of COVID. And then as part of our overall Bible project, I think everyone of our listeners knows, we're bringing out that gorgeous Word on Fire Bible. And it features commentary from me. So I had done, a fair amount of commentary over the years about the New Testament, but for the Old Testament, we needed more commentary. So I started doing some of that, and it grew into this more extended, really book-length commentary. So this really is volume 1 of 2. I've just now commenced writing volume 2, which will be on the prophets and the so-called wisdom literature of the Old Testament. So I hope, please God, at the end of this project, we'll have about a 600-page commentary on the whole Old Testament. Now, because of COVID, I did have more time to work on this first volume. So we'll see how it goes now that I'm, ordinary in this diocese and we don't have a pandemic going on. It might be a little slower going.
All right, well, let's shift to the topic of today, which is art. I couldn't believe some of these stories, and more importantly, the photos of some of these scandals. I wish we could share them online. Maybe people can Google them, but there's been a shocking uptick in the number of people destroying art for political reasons. Let me give you a few examples. So there were 2 environmental activists who threw a can of tomato soup over one of the most famous paintings in the world, Vincent van Gogh's Sunflowers. That group was those 2 people represented a larger group called Just Stop Oil, which released this statement demanding that the UK government halt all new oil and gas projects. So that was their activist motive. The same group glued themselves to another famous painting in the National Gallery in London, And then others glued themselves to a first century BC statue in the Vatican museums. We'll come back to that incident a little later in the discussion. My first question is, does this alarm you? What do you make of this specific type of art vandalism?
Well, my first reaction, Brandon, is rather sophomoric. I remember years and years, this is almost literally sophomoric because it was a conversation I had in college. I think I was a junior, though, at the time, one of my classmates, and he was filled with righteous indignation along these same lines and said, we should just tear down Chartres Cathedral and sell it if it fed, even 100 starving people. And why do we have the Sistine Chapel? We should just sell that and use the money to feed the hungry. Well, I get it, but I say it's sophomoric because it just is such a gross reductionism in regard to the transcendentals. If you look at the good, the true, and the beautiful, the good indeed is our commitment to be virtuous and to be morally upright. The good, that's one of the transcendental values. So of course, that matters immensely. The fact that we're sensitive to people who are hungry and thirsty and that we have to respond to their needs, yeah. But the other two transcendentals also should preoccupy our minds and spirits, the true, the search for truth, and the beautiful. So the arts represent this very high engagement with that third transcendental of the beautiful, and you can't reduce any one to the other. You can't emphasize one at the complete expense of the other. Now, there might be in the course of your life a moment when you're going to privilege one or the other, or maybe by predilection, you're going to be more attuned to the true or to the beautiful than the good or whatever, and that's fine. But what you can't do, seems to me, is to say we can dispense with the other two because one of them has become so central to our preoccupation. So sure, are there people who are suffering and is there great injustice in the world? Of course. But does that mean I can destroy beautiful things in order to address that problem? No. It's a sort of reduction of the transcendentals to one.
One thing that struck me was that rather than making rational arguments in support of their cause, something that you and I have championed for years on this podcast, instead they engage in what might be described as performative or transgressive art. They themselves are performing art and by destroying art. I just find that both ironic but interesting.
Yeah, it's, shock value, and as you say, kind of a transgressive move, to get people's attention. But the reductionism of it is just too dangerous. And I just think, Brandon, I go back to Malcolm Miller, the man who used to give tours at Chartres Cathedral. And maybe I've cited him before on this show, but he gave a talk I heard one time about reform in the church. And he said, sure, ecclesia semper reformanda. The church must always be reformed because the church is always falling off from its ideal. So, of course, there's a reforming spirit. So he said, I affirm that. But then he said, the best sign that a reformation process has gone wrong is when people start destroying beautiful things. And that always struck me as just dead right. Whenever this sort of iconoclasm breaks out, like let's start destroying beautiful things in the name of whatever, in the name of, honoring God's transcendence, or in the name of the poor, or in the name of, raising consciousness, something has gone wrong. And that transgressive move ought not to be applauded.
I like that insight. I think it's right. I was recently speaking about some of these stories with Father Steve Gruno, our CEO at Word on Fire, and he said something very profound right along the lines that you just quoted. Here's what Father Steve said. He said, there should be a warning signal that goes off whenever people start attacking beautiful things.
Yeah.
Whenever there's iconoclasm, there's anti-humanism. And whenever there's anti-humanism, there's anti-God. Is that how you see the trajectory?
Yeah, I wish Father Steve would write more because you're right. He always has great insights. And he and I talk all the time. And he has this kind of Lincoln-esque quality. He tends to speak that way, like in these lapidary phrases. And that's very, well formulated. Because, right, the beautiful is tied to the human. It's something that's distinctive to us. And the human is tied to God because it's God who gives us our dignity as human beings. And so when you start unraveling those connections, when you say, well, the beautiful doesn't matter, well, then right on the tail of that comes an anti-humanism. Well, then human beings don't really matter. And then if they don't really matter, well, then, God shouldn't be in the picture because we matter because of God. And so, yeah, I think that integrated view begins to unravel rapidly. And the way into that unraveling is to start wrecking beautiful things. I think, Brandon, go back to the early days of like John Damascene in the 7th and 8th centuries, the iconoclast controversy. That's when the church really engages us for the first time, when there were literally smashers of icons. That's what iconoclast means. Then the Reformation, the 16th century, there was another iconoclastic outbreak. And it was terrible. You can see the effects of it still in Europe and some of the great churches. You see in our country where there are many Protestant churches that are just kind of empty spaces. They didn't so much smash the icons, but they just sort of then ignored the iconic. But another one, to be frank, is in my own lifetime, after Vatican II. Not because of Vatican II, but after Vatican II in our country, there was a real iconoclastic outbreak. And Ecclesia Semper Reformanda, but it's gone wrong when people start destroying beautiful things. So yeah, it's a very disturbing sign, you might say, within the culture. It's a disturbance in the force, as Obi-Wan Kenobi would say, right? But it's a disturbance in that integration that Father Steve was talking about.
Why does it seem that along with Gnosticism, which is this heresy that's haunted us for the last 1900, 2000 years, iconoclasm seems to be another one of those dangers that just doesn't go away. It can't be defeated. It just lingers up and down the centuries.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, and there's not an easy answer. But I think one angle, and I've read some psychologists talk about this, there's in the presence of the beautiful, there's awe and appreciation, right, when we're at our best. But at some level, too, there can be a resentment of it. Like, well, I can't do that. Or who are these people that are spending all this money to make these things? And there's something about the beautiful that can raise the hackles in us. And we say, well, I don't know. I find that offensive and sort of reversion to the least common denominator. So maybe like even in the name of equality, if you're standing in the presence of Michelangelo's David, which I have, or the Pietà, who is this man that was able to do this? I mean, how do you even explain that? And might it stir up a resentment? Or who are these, aristocrats who have the money to afford this kind of thing? And, what about the common people? So there's that instinct toward egalitarianism or a certain anti-elitist instinct that I think can feed this animosity toward the arts sometimes.
Another thing that struck me about these stories of people destroying art with political motives is that I think everybody would agree, we should protect the environment, we should care about global justice and all those things. But the language they use elevates those concerns above everything else. I want to read you a quote here from one of the young women who glued herself to the sculpture of Laocoon and his sons at the Vatican Museums. Again, 1st century BC statue that is a priceless artifact. And this lady glues herself to it. Here's what she says. There will be no open museums, no art, no beauty in a world plagued by the climate and ecological emergency. Drought, floods, fires, pollution, scarcity of resources will take over if radical choices are not made in this regard. And I think what struck me was the apocalyptic, almost religious type of language used by these activists.
Yeah, and notice that's a beautiful example of what we're talking about of the gross radical reductionism involved there. Because there are moral outrages, everything else has to cede. Well, when won't there be moral outrages? So let's say we solve the climate problem, or we solve world hunger, or whatever the problem is. Trust me, there'll be another set of problems coming along in the next generation. And so you say, there'll be no art, there'll be no beauty, there'll be no cathedrals, no museums. Well, that means there will never be any of these things because there will always be these issues. Which then leads to your second point, really, about what I call the immanentizing of the eschatological. If ultimacy, we expect ultimacy to be achieved here, Well, then we use rhetoric like that. It all comes down to our decisions to make things better in this world. But if you say, as the great religious traditions do, that our real eschatological fulfillment is not in this world, and in fact, this world will always be marked, as the Lord himself said, the poor you will always have with you, meaning there'll always be something flawed and imperfect about this world and our capacity to address its problems. And the eschaton that we hope for is not within this temporal framework. It's beyond space and time. It's a heavenly eschaton. So when you immanentize the eschatological, you'll get rhetoric like that. And she sounds to me very much like Puritans of most ages, even of a religious stripe. It has that sense of absolute rigor and ultimacy. My way or the highway, it must be this or everything will collapse. That sounds like end of the world apocalypticism, but now in a secular framework.
I want to get your feedback on another quote that one of the protesters said. This one I thought was very profound. This protester glued himself to a Constable painting in the National Gallery in London. And here's what he shouted to everyone watching. When billions of people are in pain and suffering, what use is art? Mm-hmm. How would you respond to that?
Well, I mean, one thing is, look up and down the centuries, it's often the poor and the suffering who most appreciate the beautiful. Think of the poor who contributed massively to the building of the great medieval cathedrals. They wouldn't have happened without the sponsorship of kings and dukes and lords and all that, but they were largely built by very poor, ordinary people who were undoubtedly suffering immensely, and they felt a tremendous connection to these great works of art and wanted them. They knew they wouldn't have articulated it this way, but they knew in their bones the connection between the transcendentals, that the beautiful matters. Or I think of Reynold Hillenbrand, who, the rector of Mundelein Seminary in the 40s, leader in the liturgical movement, kind of a hero to me. And he said the poor need beauty as much as they need food and drink. And here's a guy who was, massively concerned about social justice, great friend of Dorothy Day and, all that. But at the same time, listen again to that. The poor need beauty as much as they need food and drink. And so don't drive wedges. Don't play this either or game with it. Now, let me add something, Brandon, because whenever this discussion comes up, I think of this. So yes, the three transcendentals, mutually implicative. We shouldn't play reductionistic games and one off the other. But I will say this, because these people, I want to give them the best spin. They are speaking out of a certain conviction that Dietrich von Hildebrand talks about. Namely, if you look at the three transcendentals, right, the good, the true, and the beautiful. Let's say a young person, for economic reasons or reasons of his family or whatever, is not able to achieve the truth the way he could have or should have. Never got a good education, never had access to books, never talked to smart people, and so his capacity for the true was truncated, right? Let's say that the same young person never achieved anything in the aesthetic realm, was never taught what makes something beautiful, never was brought to Gothic churches or to great paintings. And so the aesthetic side of his life was stymied, right? In those two cases, von Hildebrand said, we'd say, it's tragic. That's terrible. That's unfortunate, of course. But let's say this same person never achieved the good, never was morally upright, never loved his neighbor, never acted according to virtue and justice. We wouldn't just say, yeah, boy, that's really regrettable. We'd say that is abominable. That's horrific. That's something we would cry to heaven about. And his point, I think, is yes, the three transcendentals, yes, mutual implication, but there is a kind of primacy to the good. There's a kind of primacy to moral achievement and moral excellence. And that if you are forced to choose, you probably would choose the good as the road you should walk. So I'm gonna go a little bit down that road with some of these folks and give them as much credit as I can, that they are seized by this very strong sense of the moral imperative. We should be. And it does, if von Hildebrand is right, it does have a kind of primacy. Call it like a primus inter pares sort of primacy. So maybe first among equals belongs to the moral dimension.
Well, in the last few minutes here, I wanted to get your thoughts on art in general. So I wanted to zoom out of these particular scenarios and talk about the value of art in general. In G.K. Chesterton's classic book, The Everlasting Man, he makes this interesting observation in a pithy quote per his wont. He says, "Art is the signature of man." Art is the signature of man. He observes that the earliest human records that we have are cave paintings. 64,000 years ago, these caves in Spain, we see drawings of animals that the earliest cavemen, if you want to call them, made on the walls. So the first recorded human act is art. And Chesterton observes, we don't find that among any other living being. I'm going to quote him here. He says, "We could dig very deep and find the place where a man had drawn the picture of a reindeer, but he would dig a good deal deeper before he found a place where a reindeer had drawn a picture of a man. It must seem at least odd that we could not find any trace of the beginning of any arts among the animals. That is the simplest lesson to learn in the cavern of the colored pictures. It is the simple truth that man does differ from the brutes in kind and not in degree." What do you make of that observation that art is the signature of man?
Yeah, it's right. And Chesterton there joins a group of philosophers and thinkers over the centuries who try to put their finger on what's distinctive to human beings. So Aristotle, we're the zoon logikon, we're the animal that has speech, or that got rendered in Latin as the rational animal, that we have capacity for rational thought. Karl Marx said man is the productive animal. So you got all kinds of different definitions. But Chesterton, who was an artist himself, trained as an artist first, writes, of course, in a very artistic way. He's not a rationalistic writer. He's a much more artistic writer. What I would say is the capacity to appreciate the beautiful and to produce the truly beautiful is unique to human beings because it's tied to intellection. See, I'd bring Aristotle and Aquinas and Chesterton together because art is not like just making pretty pictures. It's, remember, as we've said, integritas, consonantia, claritas. It's wholeness, harmony, and radiance. And part of what you're producing when you make something really beautiful is that concordance of parts that make up an integrated whole. And that integrated whole then becomes radiant. There's the claritas. And the radiance is, as Jacques Maritain said, the radiance of form. It's the radiance of structured, harmonic intelligibility. Well, see, animals aren't capable of that. That's his point. But human beings, the rational animal, because we have this, we have a capacity to intuit essences or forms. That's why we can create something beautiful. Because the form, when it's appreciated intellectually, that's understanding intelligibility. But when the splendor of form is appreciated, that's the beautiful. So we can see it, and then we can produce it. If you're gifted enough, you can produce your own splendor formae, the splendor of form. So I would tie all that together, right? The man is the rational animal, and therefore he's the artistic animal.
Well, as we close, let me ask you one final question. What's special about a Christian understanding of art? How does the incarnation affect our relationship to art?
Well, that's just it, right? Because as Paul said, Christ is the icon of the invisible God. So he's the visible representation of the invisible God. The play between the visible and the invisible is very interesting in the arts because the visible, if it does attain this level of real aesthetic quality, it draws you through it toward the invisible source of all beauty, toward the pure form, if you want, who is God, the pure intelligibility, which is the divine intelligibility. So the incarnation is God making an icon of himself so that through the visibility of Christ's humanity, we can see the invisibility of God. That is the ground of all properly Christian art, has that same basic inspiration. That even in the simplest work of art, I should be able to intuit something of the invisible beauty of God.
Well, it's time now for our question from one of our listeners. If you'd like to ask Bishop Barron a question, visit the website askbishopbarron.com, and there you can record your question on any device. Today we hear from John in Ohio, who's got a question about God's nature. Here's John's question.
My name is John from Ohio, and my question is, Bishop Barron, I've heard you many times say that God's true nature is love, but isn't it also truth? Could you discuss the interplay and relationship between love and truth? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. If you want God's, most fundamental Old Testament name, it's being. So, I am who I am, we hear in the Old Testament. Ipsum esse would be Aquinas' way of rendering that. God is the active to be itself. Well, that means that God is the fullness of reality. That means the fullness of truth and the fullness of goodness. Well, what's love? Love is to will the good of the other. And so God wills his own good. Now, what that means is not that God's missing something, but his will rests in the goodness that he is. His will enjoys the beauty and goodness that he is. And that's, you see, in God, therefore, truth and goodness come together. So that's why the divine love is certainly correlated to the divine truth. What God is loving is his own goodness, which is the same as his truth, if that makes sense. So all that really comes together in the divine manner of being.
Well, as we wrap up our discussion today, I want to remind you one more time to pick up your copy of Bishop Barron's newest book. Again, it's titled The Great Story of Israel. It is a theological and spiritual commentary on the first half of the Old Testament. So if you want to better understand the Old Testament, everything from Genesis all the way through 2nd Maccabees, this is the book you're going to want to pick up. I'll make sure we link to it in the show notes so you can pick up your copy today. Well, thanks so much for listening and watching, and we'll see you next time on the Word on Fire show.